All right, time for an unusually heavy discussion. As we move into the Romantic period from the Enlightenment, the die has been cast. But it seems to take the West a very, very long time to realize what the implications are. In fact, as we've mentioned, it takes so long that we impatient moderns often miss it. It might be best to think of it as a rolling process of reacting to ultimate despair. Each generation and person seems to have to travel that path on their own, believing somehow against all available evidence that this time they'll somehow make it all work. When the person or the movement finally personally crosses the line of despair, a remnant, like a Wordsworth or a Coleridge or a Lewis, return to common sense and the faith. Others, like a Nietzsche, reinforce failure on an epic level. The result is that as a majority culture, the line of despair in the modern West has become like a cliff for lemmings. While some turn back in time, many more rush headlong over it, convinced against all odds that salvation lies somehow in the wreck at the bottom. Looking back at our flow, as we move into the second term, we're seeing the modern period begin to shoot up from the ground that the Enlightenment had plowed so thoroughly. As you should remember, the original experiment was simple. Can humanity use reason as its sole source of knowledge and meaning? The idea was that through reason and its handmade science, humans using nothing more than their brains and the evidence of their senses would be able to accomplish all that humans had previously relied on God for. Now, if we peel that back a bit, we discover that reason isn't so much at the bottom of it all, nor was science an end in and of itself. Yes, they appeared to worship both, but they were really a simple stand-in for the ultimate focus of adoration, humanity itself. Once again, reason doesn't exist in practice outside the human application of it. Science doesn't exercise itself at all. Nothing else in the physical universe outside of humanity has ever been observed to apply reason or science in any meaningful sense to anything. So in effect, what we've seen is the deification of humanity. Humans are, once again, trying to achieve the status Adam and Eve first sought in Eden. But as we've also already seen, this effort is destined for failure. While some thinkers like Hume and Rousseau can play the game and talk the talk of enlightened scientific sovereign quite well, it only holds as long as we agree not to dig too deeply. Already Descartes, Kant, and Solomon have plumbed those depths. Descartes discovered that in the absence of God, there is no way to really know anything other than the fact that I exist. Kant explored the mechanism of our not knowing in his transcendental idealism and discovered that on our own power, we can't even prove the existence of the chair that we're sitting in or say anything about it, let alone accomplish anything so grand as playing God. Solomon much earlier rightly concluded that all of these pursuits, independent of God, are a complete waste, nothing but vanity. Increasingly, subsequent thinkers and actors begin to catch up. Humans need truth and meaning. As they search for something real and absolute down the nocturne alley of secular enlightenment and modern philosophy and science, we'll hear an increasingly desperate cry. Where can we stand? What can we believe in? Why does it all matter? Why am I important and what do I mean? As we move through the 1800s into the 1900s, we'll see them continue to desperately search through reason. And that may seem fine if you have a logical, analytical mind and you feel empowered by implying it. But for more sensitive souls, just being cold and correct, even if attainable, isn't enough. For example, 2 plus 2 does indeed equal 4, but what does that mean? And how does it give value to your life? And if, in the end, science fails to really deliver what was promised, as Kant demonstrated it would, then you have to try a different route to meaning. They'll search for it in the Romantic movement. Romanticism is really the opposite of reason, not faith. It looks to bald, manufactured feelings and emotions to provide meaning and truth that reason by itself could not reach. Versions of both reason and Romanticism will continue this desperate search for some solid ground on which to build a life, even down to the present day, with each new thinker exploring some new human aspect or implication of each, or revisiting an old one for the 10,000th time, and each convinced that the answers they so desperately need are still there somewhere. It's just that the people who went before were never able to find them. Maybe I'll be different. What we see demonstrated in the authors of this section is that humanity needs religion, and even as it tries to destroy religion, all it accomplishes is the creation of pseudo-religions to take its place. The central problem that reason and romanticism both face is the very same methods and discoveries that promise secular salvation ultimately lead them to the line of despair. On the surface, both reason and romanticism seem to promise a way for humans to find meaning and truth, but only if you play the game. You have to willfully cut yourself off from the truth and refuse to follow things to their logical conclusions. You have to scratch the surface and pretend that the rest doesn't exist. As we read each major author in this section, you'll find that for every grand naturalistic discovery, after an exciting and idealistic time of exploration, there comes a corresponding failure and increasing sense of desperation. Consider the possibilities. Where might we find meaningful absolutes if we refuse to look to God? Can we find them in nature? Not realistically. As Kant and Descartes showed, starting with a general idea of nature by itself simply ends in unsustainable skepticism and meaningless subjectivism. Even if we take a leap of faith, a naturalistic universe is random, meaningless, and anti-logical. If we look at the biological side alone, we find animals committing infanticide, rape, and murder. Neither real truth nor an enlightened equal society or high personal moral standards are sustainable by anyone being honest with themselves based purely on nature. Can we simply make an effort of our feelings and imaginations and, like the Romantics, just try to feel our way toward truth and meaning? Well, it depends on how willing you are to be dishonest with yourself. Most people's innate reason and need for truth won't let them live with that for long, not if their moral and intellectual faculties are functioning properly. What about searching for it in the human spirit? Well, there's definitely something to admire in humanity. As Christians, we can recognize it as the image of God. The problem is that it is only a reflection, not the thing itself. No faith in humanity ultimately survives contact with humanity because for every story of love, generosity, and brilliance we encounter, there seem to be two of hatred, greed, and idiocy. And when one of the latter happens to you, it tends to take on disproportionate meaning, to say the least. The wrong done you often seems much more real than the good you've heard about. If you haven't experienced this personally yet, sadly, it's probably only a matter of time. Can we deify everything and look for meaning and significance in the face of the void of meaninglessness itself, as Nietzsche did? In many ways, this is the bravest and most pitiable attempt of all, railing against the meaningless of humanity in the face of what makes humanity meaningless, trying to wrench meaning from it, and ultimately failing utterly. In each case, finding meaning depends on how hard you are able to close your eyes to the facts and lie to yourself. In the beginning, when you are first looking into it, you can genuinely fool yourself into honest belief in any of these ideas. But if you keep on learning and keep on studying, they all inevitably self-destruct as ways to truth, leaving you with nothing. So how do people keep doing it? Much of it has to do with faith. Most of these positions, and many more, begin with an emotional, blind faith dedication to the idea of human godhood. That is accepted as the number one unshakable fact. Then it becomes a quote-unquote simple question of figuring out how to get there and by which way. And so you begin the discussion convinced of your final destination as if you'd already arrived at it. You explore one option after the other until you find one that you think suits, until you have to give it up. And since the ultimate source of this belief is faith-based, in theory, no amount of evidence to the contrary will ever dislodge you. But unlike Thanos, it is truly inevitable. Every one of these myths eventually crumbles given enough time, and you will discover that you are, in fact, not Iron Man. As we move into our authors, starting with Emerson and Whitman, To be fair to the Romantic movement, there was good and bad thinking in it. Romanticism turned to beauty and love and nature to find its significance, and the reality is that we see all three of those things writ large in nature as a result of general revelation. There is beauty in nature because there is beauty in the artist who created it. So, when confronted with that reality in the approaching line of despair, several prominent romantics returned to true faith and looked for that beauty in God himself. Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth are two examples. At the same time, when you look for beauty in a painting, where are you finding it? Is paint by itself, lying there in a colorless glob, beautiful? Is the empty, mindless, meaningless canvas itself what captures your imagination and your attention in the painting? Of course not. What does is your ability to see beyond the material composition of the painting to the brilliance of the painter and how he uses those elements to create something that is far greater than the sum of its parts. Emerson and Whitman are good examples of this blind faith secularism that sought for emotional fulfillment and transcendent beauty in physical things. They were both the sorts of men who needed more than just dry, cold, logical existence, though Emerson himself was all for that too. It wasn't simply enough to think that you were right. You had to mean something too. And the secular romantics searched hard for it inside nature and humanity in itself. Reading them, you should be able to get a good feeling for how someone could think for a while, that meaning and truth could be found in the beauty of nature and of man. Unfortunately, while they are inspiring and generally brilliant, they never found a way around the central problem, and eventually they ran smack into reality too. While it sounds good on paper to talk about the glories of progress in human nature, the 20th century, with its massive bloodshed and lost opportunities, was enough to sour people on this overly idealistic view of human nature and the kind of world that humans would build. If there is any one singular secular savior to which people look even today, it is Charles Darwin. Darwin was a biologist and a naturalist, one of several people to posit the idea of naturalistic evolution about that time. The reason we remember Darwin and not the others is simple. Darwin heard that the others were coming and rushed his book to publication before they were finished. If you recall, when we talked about the Enlightenment, we said that they basically kept God around for one reason, and one reason only, to explain life and the universe. So they posited the convenience of deism, where God exists, creates the world, and then politely steps off the stage so people can live like atheists if they so choose. What Darwin does is provide a way out of this apparent dilemma that, at a shallow reading, seems to explain the complexity of biological life without the need to invoke God on any level. Biologists had accepted and understood the idea of change for centuries by this point. Anyone who worked with animals knew that. It was the basic process of breeding. Further, in light of the Enlightenment and the ideas of human progress, people were looking to progress itself more and more as an end in and of itself. Progress wasn't a result so much as the mechanism of life itself, and this worked itself out in a number of different ways. Darwin's idea was one manifestation of this greater movement. Instead of just using progress to explain how we got change within species, for example, 250 different kinds of cows, 200 different breeds of horses, 360 breeds of dogs, etc., Darwin argued that biological progress could explain everything. A series of very small accidental changes regulated by natural selection could explain the origins of every kind of life in the universe. If that were true, then secularists no longer needed to even pretend to believe in God as a convenience. In practice, what Darwin does is invent an Enlightenment creation myth. Importantly, it also meant that humans were simply another kind of advanced animal. While that might sound innocuous at first, give it a little time. While Darwin himself wasn't so grand in his pronouncements, this was the real birthplace of modern atheism. The problem, as we'll see, is that Darwin was postulating with very incomplete evidence. At the time, the fossil record was very incomplete. And so, very often in his book, Darwin doesn't deliver evidence so much as promise that he's right, and so you can trust him, the evidence will be coming, one day, in the future. So, the repeated evidential refrain in On the Origin of Species is mañana, mañana, tomorrow, you'll get your proof later. From the very beginning, what we see in Darwin really isn't so much science as it is faith in the use of presuppositions. People friendly to Darwin's ideas adopted them eagerly because they liked them, not because conclusive evidence was provided to show that they were true. Once they had adopted Darwinism as their unchallenged presupposition, they simply interpreted all future evidence in light of it, and therefore all future evidence was found to support it. Surprise, surprise. In fact, the theory of macroevolution has been modified so many times that the current view is virtually unrecognizable to Darwin's original concept, because it turns out the fossil record did not support Darwin's ideas. So the subsequent faithful have patched it again and again and again to try to make up for it. The result is, in practice, that Darwinism functions more like a practical religion, explaining by faith the origins of the world, and Darwin's book acts for many people like holy scriptures that are revered, even if they're never actually read. If you approach Darwinism as distinct from the specific scientific theory of evolution, if you approach Darwinism as a religion, all sorts of things start making sense that made no sense before. But what Darwin does is give humanity its justification for regarding itself as deity. No reasonable person could contest that humanity was the most intelligent, most promising, most complex, and most effective creature in existence. Therefore, with nothing higher than humanity, humans become the de facto lords of the universe, and they begin to act and talk like it over time. Think back to Emerson and all his praise of human nature and human potential, and you should be able to see how mutually reinforcing all of this is. Finally, remember that Darwin himself doesn't carry things this far. His excitable acolytes do. Darwin himself has a tone of ultimate, complete, and responsible moderation, but the people who take his ideas and run with them throw all of that to the wind. Darwin's basic idea becomes the impetus for all sorts of secular crusading, again, some progressive in the sense that they are trying to accomplish something, such as building their national utopias, and some regressive in the sense that they're tearing things down, as they do with religion and existing science. They specifically posit that humans will be able to take control of their own evolution and become anything they want. In any case, it will be incredibly consequential in all kinds of ways. Karl Marx was a rabble-rouser and more or less contemporary of Darwin, publishing his Communist Manifesto only 10 years before Darwin did Origin of Species. Marx used the ideals of the age to accomplish for history and government what Darwin later would for science. He started from a position of practical atheism and claimed that he had identified the central process of history. Two groups, the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy and the workers, squared off across time. The haves always oppressed and tyrannized the have-nots by stealing the fruit of all their labor and collecting it in rising concentrations of wealth. The rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. Sound familiar? Eventually, the have-nots decide that they're done and they rise up and overthrow the haves. In doing so, they become the new haves themselves, and the former haves become the new slaves. Then the cycle repeats itself again and again and again. Marx's big idea was that, like evolution, if this process was natural, that humans will be able to seize control of it and bend it to their will. So Marx promised that if you follow the communist way of thinking, humanity could break the cycle and create a perfect world of peace and prosperity. How do you do that? By eliminating private property, putting all the wealth and resources in the hands of the government, and then trusting the government to make sure that everyone has an equal share. If everyone had what they needed and no more, so the thinking went, then there would be no more conflict and the world would be at peace. This vision of the future is, like Darwin's explanation of the past, best understood as a form of religion. In Marx's Holy Scriptures, he provides his adherents with a unifying story that explains reality and imbues it with meaning. It identifies the original sin that is haunting the world and keeping humanity from perfection. It gives a prophecy of how the future will be, and in doing so, offers a promise of salvation. If accepted, It assures us that we will enjoy a perfect, sinless, peaceful world. Therefore, most of its followers accept it on the basis of faith in its premise rather than evidence of its provability. And that simply makes sense. How exactly do you scientifically, objectively prove Marx's ideas? Instead, on the secular view, you either simply find them compelling or you don't. And for the people who do, you'll find that they often hold to them with all the passion of the most fervent religious believer. Just talk to them and you'll see. Marxism is also important in that it can help provide a semblance of moral impetus and a vague framework for the appearance of moral significance. Marx gives his people a clear idea of what is right and what is wrong inside his system, and in that framework, you can find at least temporary meaning in the Marxist crusade for utopia. This is one reason why, when you discuss Marxism with a serious Marxist, it quickly becomes apparent that Marxism isn't simply a convenient theory for them. It provides the central meaning to their life. And so, to question it is really more like questioning the virginity of Mary to a Catholic. It also helps explain why, no matter how many times Marxism, socialism, and communism fail, there remain people who will kill and die to see it happen again. The belief in Marxism is based very often not on reason, but on emotion and a desire cloaked in a form of rationality. So, contrary evidence often has no effect on it whatsoever. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche rounds out our dirty half-dozen-ish of authors for this section. He is in many ways insightful, incisive, and brilliant. What's more, he can write in what for many people is dramatic prose that draws them in and excites them for his ideas. That makes his case all the more tragic because while his diagnosis of the emerging modern condition is genius, he somehow seems to only find and offer the most bone-headed prescriptions for curing it. You may find yourself spending your time reading him saying things like, "Yes, exactly, precisely, you're almost there, and no, you just flushed it all down the toilet." And then again, "Right, indeed, spot on, where the heck did you pull that from?" It makes reading Nietzsche a complex and interesting exercise. Nietzsche is far-seeing. He correctly predicts all of this rational, romantic tilting at windmills that we've seen, and he shows that it will, in the end, accomplish nothing. It is myth-making in the worst sense of the word because it involves telling an inspiring story, alleging to give meaning to life based on nothing but lies and falsehoods. It isn't a case of just finding the right modern myth. There is no modern myth capable of replacing the one that modernism and the Enlightenment have killed off, which is what Nietzsche meant when his madman famously said that God is dead and we have killed him. But instead of turning around and looking back behind the accumulations of the modern to something more solid, Nietzsche says that if our lives are destined for oblivion, we should just own it. If you're standing on a train track and a train is barreling at you, don't get off the track, run straight at it. Humans must define their own meaning through a raw act of will he called the will to power, and in doing so wrench some form of meaning from the meaningless, pitiless universe. This idea, called existentialism, truly attempts to fulfill Satan's promises in Eden by granting humanity total control over truth, right, and wrong. Things become meaningful and moral and true because humans say so, nothing more and nothing less. This, of course, sounds very grand and heroic. You can get the vision of Nietzsche standing up to the dark expanse of the universe and shaking his hand defiantly as the avatar of humanity. It certainly has inspired generations of similar thinkers, including the Nazis and their leader, Adolf Hitler. Unfortunately, it should only take a moment to understand its ultimate futility. The image of the man shaking his fist at the cosmos is just an image. It is a piece of the imagination of an infinitesimally small and insignificant thing, so small as to not even matter in the grand scheme of things, to not even leave a smudge or a stain on the universe. There is no content behind it outside the pitiful desires of a man driven crazy by his own meaninglessness, and the day will come when it will not even be remembered. And the same is true of anyone who tries to emulate him. There is nothing in it, and there is no one significant to appreciate it if there was. That's why Nietzsche's worldview is called nihilism, from the Latin for nothing. In practice, it is the admission of ultimate, utter failure. It is a form, in fact, of intellectual and spiritual suicide, and it should terrify us that large portions of contemporary society embrace his ideas in practice, if not in name. Nietzsche also predicted the ultimate end of modern philosophy in postmodernism. Modernism tried to make humanity the centerpiece of the universe, and that centerpiece failed. Postmodernism reacts to this and takes the opposite extreme. Humans go from defining reality to defining nothing and knowing nothing. There is no truth, and if there was, you couldn't know it, and anything you say about it is useless. There is no right or wrong, and humans are left to wander aimlessly through meaninglessness and nonsense, and to try to latch on to whatever makes them feel good or gives them significance for a moment. And the one sin that can be committed is to suggest that someone could be wrong about something. Sadly, in the end, it is unsustainable. In my history classes, one of the themes I continually pound on is that ideas have consequences. As do these. In fact, they are key to understanding the world around you in the 21st century and the minds of people, organizations, universities, colleges, and pop culture phenomena. These ideas bear fruit in the mid-20th century, and those fruit are clearly poisonous. So far, I've generally stuck to the positive side of these ideas, even as I've critiqued them, presenting them as fairly as I could, often in the light I think their originators would have liked. This is what they offered the world. I did this because we need to understand how someone can believe an evil thing if we want to know how to watch out for similar things today. But there were undoubtedly some darker applications. Let's consider some and some of the real-world results that we've already seen come about in history. If there is no God, and the universe is just the eternal result of an accidental, meaningless cause, and humans are merely animals with no eternal significance, a la Darwin, if human nature is really the greatest good we can know, see the secular romantics, if right and wrong are just personal whim and humans have only the value that other humans choose to imbue them with, consider Nietzsche, and if the only thing standing between us and utopia is a lack of political will to implement a new system, as we see in Marx, we can quickly enter what they call interesting times. If humans define right and wrong, if morals exist only in our own heads, then what's to stop us from justifying lying or even murder as easily as we do divorce and cheating on a loved one? If humans are just animals and we can control evolution, why not treat them that way and cull your herd? If the only absolute is human evolution and progress, if humans are justified in doing whatever is necessary in order to create a perfect world, where do you stop and why, especially with those that you think are in the way of your perfect world? And before you go to sleep thinking this is all academic, look at the actual historical results. The American eugenics movement explicitly endorsed these ideas when they forcibly sterilized thousands of citizens that it deemed unworthy of reproducing in an attempt to create a better human race. Historian Richard Weikart has traced a direct line between Darwin's thought and the Nazi Holocaust. What was the real goal behind the final solution? Just to be mean to the Jews? No, it was to take control of evolution by any means necessary and further the creation of an ideal race, Hitler's Aryans in this case. When Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin created Russian communism, and when Mao Zedong took power in communist China, it was with the open goal of realizing Marx's utopia, and with the atheistic disregard for human life, they exerted their will to power by simply murdering anyone who stood in the way of their revolutions. The end result was probably over 100 million people killed. And who could complain? What makes the killing of one inconvenient animal by another meaningless animal in a universe with no purpose in any way wrong? How can you condemn it? On what basis? And before we think this is only a societal curse that brings down nations, it helps to remember that it also directly affects individual people in measurable ways. The idea that there are no moral absolutes directly contributed to the thinking that resulted in the famous Columbine High School massacre, for example. The shooters explicitly appealed to these ideas in their manifesto, and one of them even wore a shirt emblazoned with the words "natural selection" while on the rampage. And you can actually buy copies of that shirt now online to give you an idea of the state of society. Closer to home, we probably all know someone who has made life-changing decisions based on the thought that truth is simply what they define it to be. They simply look at everything and they say, "I don't want that to be right," and they do the opposite. Time after time, these people injure themselves and others while trying their best to convince themselves that what they're doing is really a good and positive thing. We are, right now, living in the deeps of the consequences of these ideas. So for the next few weeks, I invite you to join in as we wrestle with them in a safe place, because I can almost guarantee you that the next time you do face them, either as a person making individual life choices or as a voter in the booth attempting to decide which politician has the vision to lead this nation, a lot more will be riding on how you handle it than just a grade.